Most people in Europe don't realise how many people Julius Caesar actually killed.
We have ancient sources that say 1 million killed, 1 million enslaved. And perfectly respectable, not implausible. And very recently, there's been quite a lot of battlefield archaeology. This is a bit unfashionable, but it's actually fascinating at the moment what it's bringing up, where you can really see the kind of extraordinary devastation that his soldiers are committing, even within the battles themselves, no matter what happens afterwards. You get whole regions where nothing grows for centuries.
Wow.
Because he's basically wiped out the people who lived there completely.
The word civilization is used a lot, particularly in political contexts. People talk about inferior civilizations, superior civilizations, civilisational continuity between the past, the present, and the future. Generally speaking, in Britain and Europe, we view our civilization, Western civilization, as starting in ancient Greece. It then passes the baton on to Rome, onto the Middle Ages, Christendom's there somewhere too, all the way through to today. As a result, we view European and Western civilization as culturally distinct, homogenous, its own thing, its own entity, and not really subject to influences from elsewhere. Except that is not remotely true. In fact, it's something of a myth. Today's guest is a sensational historian, person, and writer. Their latest book, How the World Made the West, talks about precisely all of this through the span of 3,500 years, starting with the earliest known civilizations, passing all the way through to the 16th century. The author, Jo Quinn, is the first woman chair of ancient history at Cambridge. And I mean it when I say this book is sensational. When it came out in hardback, it was one of my favourite books of 2024. As a result, I'm very happy to have on today's show, Jo Quinn. Jo, welcome to Downstream.
Thank you.
I am so excited about this conversation. I'm so excited. You've written this extraordinary book, How the World Made the West. I read the hardback. I've read the paperback.
Well done.
Oh my goodness. What a treat. What a treat. This may be a strange first question, but how on earth did you get to read so much?
COVID.
COVID?
Yeah, it was really conveniently timed for me. So I was, when I started writing the book, I was based at the New York Public Library. It was in the amazing Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers there. So there I had access to all the books in the world, which is completely brilliant. It's really one of the great, great libraries. But actually almost too much access because I was just reading. And I thought I would never get beyond the Bronze Age. I spent about 3 months on the end of the Bronze Age. But then, COVID happened, lockdown, I had to fly home in a hurry. And then there were no libraries for a long time. And so actually that gave me space to do the reading I had to do, but also meant that I couldn't just keep reading. And at some point I actually had to write it down. So that's how.
I mean, I believe you for the book, but just generally, obviously, you're a professor of ancient history, very esteemed historian. You've been in that game for decades. And of course, just to get your PhD, you have to be very widely read. But it does kind of feel, some of the citations in the book are just kind of wild, like very obscure Iranian, academic monograph about Middle Pahlavi script. And I'm thinking, how on earth does somebody access all of this?
So I was really lucky that I was a graduate student at Berkeley, and they have a program in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology there that I got my PhD in. And basically there they encourage you to learn as many languages and expose yourself to as many different kind of academic traditions as possible, as well as, studying a big geographical area and so on. And so it wasn't where I learned all the languages that I can use for books like this now, but it was where I learned that the more languages you learn, the easier it is to learn another one each time. Not to the extent where you could write poetry in it, but to the extent that you can work in it and you understand, you can judge other people's scholarship on it, and so on. But the other thing that I really learned in America was a very professional attitude to graduate school. And there are exams, general exams, so you have to get through. And they really train people how to do this. And one of the things they train you to do is how to read fast, or how to have confidence in fast reading. And there's a brilliant exercise I remember that I sometimes do now with my students, where I say, right, you've got a book. I'm going to give you the book for 15 minutes to read. You sit and quietly and read the book for 15 minutes. And then you have to discuss it for an hour. And they think this is crazy. You can't possibly read a book for 15 minutes and then talk about it with, a group of people for an hour. But in fact, you always can. and so I think that's not the ideal way to read a book in kind of enormous depth and so on. But I think it's a really useful confidence building exercise for people.
So when you read Sallust, I presume you read him in the Latin, you read Herodotus in the ancient Greek.
So what I do, and I hope this is true of most of my colleagues too, is that I'll probably read it in English first. I'm looking for see what I want to read. And then anything that I actually want to write about or think about more, I'll then dig out, usually my facing text edition. These are L'Herbe editions where they have the Latin or Greek on one side and the English on the other, or their French equivalents and so on, German equivalents. So I'll sort of dig that out to sort of look in more detail. But I don't usually sort of start at the beginning not in English. So I do cheat a little bit in that respect.
So when you were a PhD student, sorry to say, because I'm fascinated by people who just read so much. I remember reading about Harold Bloom reading like 8 hours a day. He had no life.
Right.
Well, his life was reading, and he's quite open about that.
Yeah, what about the committee meetings?
I know. But for you, when you were a PhD student, for instance, how many hours a day do you think you were reading?
Oh, that was wonderful. So it probably was, not probably 8, but it probably was a good 5 or 6 when I was a PhD student. And now what I try and do, because there are a lot of committee meetings, and then of course there's great stuff like teaching and so on, which takes up a certain amount of time, but I always try and keep the mornings free as much as possible, either for reading or writing. So it's nothing like 8 hours these days, or even 5 or 6, but it's still, I try and make time that's not interrupted when my phone's in a different room.
So this particular book starts from 2500 BC, and it goes all the way through to what, the 15th, 16th century?
1500, more or less. That was the sort of cut-off point.
4,000 years.
Yeah.
And the main sort of thread running through it is that civilisational thinking, sort of essentialist civilisational thinking, particularly in regard to Europe, isn't quite right. So before we get into the details of, Bronze Age collapse, etc., what's the elevator pitch for this book? What's the sort of guiding hypothesis for it?
So I guess the thinking behind it is to debunk the myth of the modern West as a self-made miracle. The idea that it created itself from within, whether that means from ancient Greece or Rome, or from Germany, or from medieval Christendom, whatever it might be. Because what I'm really arguing in the book is that, this idea of civilisations, which was invented in the 18th century, or civilization itself, it comes in the 18th century, that noun didn't exist before. The idea of plural civilisations is a 19th century invention. Nobody's ever talked about civilisations before the 1820s. But now it's such a standard, common way of thinking about the world and about history in particular, that it seems like the only questions that are left are, why do civilizations clash? Or, why does one civilization do better than others, and so on. But people aren't questioning the idea of civilizations themselves. And from my perspective, and as an ancient historian, that idea of civilizations just gets in the way of the real story of something much more complicated and entangled and connected that actually brings us to where we were in 1500, but also where we are now.
So the word civilization, as I understand it, effectively, if I think of Italian, civiltà, obviously there's a etymological relationship there to città, city, citizens. So civiltà initially meant the city or the urban area, had a connection to the idea of civic life. Our understanding of civilization-state, of civilisational thinking, you've said it comes from the 19th century, of civilisations. But clearly the word is used prior to that. So what's the evolution of this term of civilization over the last, say, 500,000 years? Sorry.
No, great question. No, see, I don't think it is really used before that. I think ideas like the idea of the civis, the citizen, is certainly an idea. And there is an idea of a city, and so that comes out in Italian, città, and so on. But that's not really the full meaning of that 18th century idea of civilization. You do get precursors to it. So from about the 16th century, you hear about the idea of things or people being civilized. That comes first. But really, it's only as a noun itself. I don't think it does translate earlier ideas very clearly. As an idea of as an idea in the first place of the sort of the highest form of sort of human flourishing, if you like, that sort of singular thing, when, civilization as culture, if you can be civilized or not civilized, it's a kind of binary idea. And Europeans are always the most civilized because they're the ones who invented the word. But then from the 19th century, this idea of plural civilizations, I think is really something quite new. And this has been controversial in my book, and I've had plenty of discussions with colleagues and other readers about it. And there certainly are arguments you can make that something, certainly an idea of us and them thinking exists in the past, and certainly ideas of citizen-based, city-based life being somehow more sophisticated than other kinds of life. But this specific 19th century idea of culture attached to very distinct areas that kind of emerge and flourish and usually in the end decline more or less alone, never completely alone. No one ever makes the claim that these civilizations are completely cut off from each other. But the idea is almost always that the spirit of the civilization comes from within. And that's just, it seems to me that's a kind of slightly crazy idea from the 1820s and 30s, when a lot of other crazy ideas were being tried out, like the idea of races and so on. And this one has stuck in a way that even things like races now, I mean, nobody's seriously going to argue with a scientist that there are such things as separate races that you can really distinguish at a sort of biological level. But at a cultural level, it's much harder to make the argument because there's no sort of test you can do on culture to say, can you separate these societies from each other completely? So what I'm really trying to do in the book is do for culture what, the genetic scientists have been doing for race over the last 25 years or so.
That's so interesting. It's something I've thought about a lot. Elizabeth Kolbert, in her fantastic book, I think Pulitzer Prize-winning book about catastrophic, extinction events. She talks about this idea in the early 19th century of extinction of a species, just breaking through, and people just think, wow, really? There were animals that didn't existed before, and now they don't exist anymore, and that gradually feeds through intellectually to the idea of superior races. And well, of course, if certain creatures have become extinct, why can't certain races, i.e., inferior races? And I see a sort of a continuity between that idea of extinction, etc., then also feeding into ideas of racial degeneracy or civilisational degeneracy with somebody like Max Nordau.
Yes.
In the late 19th century, Spengler is the sort of paradigmatic example here.
Yeah,
so that stuff is all featuring in your thinking when you talk about this stuff.
I think these things are, it's a moment where you get all these ideas, and extinction's a great one to throw into the mix. But also, of course, it's all bound up with European imperialism. All these ideas are really very helpful in the end for sort of national empires. And you can really see that change, for instance, from the idea of civilization as a kind of abstract thing where people can have it or not have it, they can be better or worse at it, but, in theory, anybody could become civilized. right education and so on, the right guidance, when that changes to an idea that there are actually separate human cultures that have, that come from within, that have their own natural characters and often their own natural limits. That's rather like races. That's a big part of the 19th century thinking about this. And that's enormously helpful for 19th century European imperialism, that all the moves to a much more direct control, much more imperial violence and so on. Not that there wasn't plenty of that in the 18th century as well, but it becomes something you don't even have to hide anymore, because these are now people who can't be helped.
So, but at the same time, you've got people like, Kipling, obviously, The White Man's Burden. J.S. Mill says that actually having a sense of unfreedom imposed on some people, subjugated to unfreedom, is fine if they're sort of led forward towards enlightenment, often by European imperial powers. So, I mean, but that supposes, doesn't it, the idea that those inferior civilizations can ascend to a form of universal civilization.
Absolutely. And Mill, I think, is the kind of the last great figure of that first stage of civilizational thinking, in a lot of ways. I mean, he's a very transitional figure in it, but he's actually writing quite late on about exactly a sort of civilizing mission, and how a lot of it is to do with British Empire in India, and how it's possible to defend that and so on. So Mill's he's kind of my last character in the first stage of the story. But by the time he's writing a lot of this stuff, there are already people who are beginning to say, no, actually, these civilizations are completely separate from each other. And even Mill has elements of that. So famously, he has this wonderful line, it's again quite late on, but there's this wonderful line about how the Battle of Marathon, where the Greeks or the Athenians first beat the Persians, how that is a more important moment in English history than the Battle of Hastings. And that's a kind of extraordinary thing to say. He says it in a book review. So perhaps it's kind of a throwaway thing, but it's an extraordinary sort of way to think about things, that the history of ancient Greece isn't just relevant to the history of your own country, but it's actually part of it. It's a sort of living part of it. And that's I think, where, you can really see the kind of fashion changing. And yes, I think in a way, sort of through his writings, you can sort of watch sort of the general ideas moving from one idea of civilization to another.
It's a remarkable thing to say, but I mean, some people watching or listening to this might say, well, that's true. It's correct. I mean, or maybe that particular battle, okay, that's not necessarily the case, but there are clearly events in our deep past which have regional or global implications, which we pretty rarely talk about. For instance, the Punic Wars or whatever clearly inflect the whole history of Europe and beyond. Do you sort of buy that, or do you just think that's just a stupid debate?
I don't think it's stupid. I don't buy it. So I think the Punic Wars are a really nice example, because they have been an enormous kind of shadow sort of hanging over European history. I mean, especially the last sort of 500 years of European history. But that's because people chose to fixate on them. They could have chosen all sorts of wars all over the world, but you choose the Punic Wars between Rome and Carthage because it makes a very nice binary pair that isn't actually true historically, but works for the purposes of metaphor, between a maritime empire and a sort of territorial land-based empire. And so that's great when your territorial empire can be France and your land-based empire can be Britain, or then maybe it changes around. Maybe your sea-based empire is Britain, but maybe the sea-based empire is the Dutch United Provinces. And so it's you can watch it. If you're Irish, you might well be, if you're Irish in the 18th century, you might well be really identifying with the Carthaginians as these people, this incredibly cultured people, society brutalized by this uncultured foreign imperial power. So I think the fact that these kind of battles and wars from the past are the ones that are chosen by the politicians and thinkers of any particular period is really telling. And I think they choose the ones that are useful for them. So I'd say that's the real interest. Probably the Persian Wars and the Punic Wars, in fact.
Well, I was going to say, so yeah, useful historical analogy. And of course, the classic one in the 21st century is World War II and Churchill and Lord Halifax, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Which, if I hear more, references to Churchill as to why we should invade or occupy somewhere, I think, my brain will melt. But what's really interesting is, again, the older I get, the more I realise that actually the Sasanian Roman conflict is actually way more interesting than the Punic Wars, and also maybe more historically relevant, because what they do by the 6th, 7th century is they've just exhausted themselves through this incredible war. And you have, the Arabs come out of the Arabian Peninsula, Islam rather, coming out of the Arabian Peninsula. So stupid question, but we like asking stupid questions here on Novara Media. Are the sort of that war between the Romans and the Sasanians, is that actually more historically important than the Carthaginian wars? Or I know you're not meant to say that as a proper academic.
Yeah, we can't do absolute importance. No, I think what's the interesting difference between them, one of the interesting differences between them, is that when you see those wars from the perspective of Western Europe, where we're sitting now, or even from the perspective of Rome, you're only seeing some of the context for them. And if you're looking down at Carthage, and you're looking at, Rome versus Carthage, there's nothing, the Carthaginians aren't really under pressure from anybody else. I mean, there are all sorts of interesting trading societies and so on in the Sahara, and all sorts of stuff going on further south in Africa. But it's not really having a kind of any sort of military impact on what the Carthaginians are up to north of the Sahara. So in a sense, that's a kind of a war where people are really focusing on each other. But what's always the case with Iran, so whether it's the Persians or the Parthians or the Sasanians, there's always other actors from a Western perspective beyond that. So I think that one of the things that would to look at wars with the Sasanians, with Iran, in the same way as looking at wars with more kind of isolated powers, is sort of to miss another side of the story always. We don't always know the other side of the story, but we do have quite a lot of information by the Sasanian period. And I think that's another reason why those wars are so interesting, is that actually we don't know a lot about the Punic Wars. We have accounts of them all from the Roman side, even if they're actually written by Greeks and so on. We don't have any of the Carthaginian accounts or accounts by their allies of what's going on. So very fragmentary bits of them. But with the Sasanians, there's just a lot more evidence of from a lot more different places by then that has actually survived. And so I think that also, it's not that it's more important exactly, but you can maybe get more new things out of it. That's how I'd go with the importance.
And you were talking about, useful historical analogies. I suppose as well, in an era of bipolarity like the Cold War, Carthage and Rome makes a lot of sense too. But when you're talking about the Sasanians, inherently you're talking about a multipolar world and more than two great powers. Yes. And again, there's that account from Mani, the 3rd century Persian prophet, and you talk about it in the book, these 4 great powers of the classical world: China, the Aksumite Empire, more on those in a minute, Persia and Rome. And, for us in the 20th and 21st centuries, that isn't really a world that's particularly tangible. But maybe we're moving to a world where actually that feels a bit more relevant,
Yeah. And I mean, that kind of idea, I think, is about as close as you get in the ancient world to something like modern civilisational thinking. I mean, it's not an idea of sort of cultured civilisations in quite the same way. It's much more an idea of political powers. But I do think there's a lot of crossover in both cases with, multipolar ideologies of kind of civilization states that we have now. So I think we are moving have moved, actually, I think, into something that's much more like that kind of world. And that may be why that sort of, what is always called by ancient historians late antique history, of course it's not late antique to most of the people involved. That I think that's why it's so popular. And I really see it among my students and colleagues and so on. It's I think it really speaks to the moment.
So what period is late antique?
So that would be, depending on your taste, going from something like the 3rd or 4th century to something like somewhere between maybe the 7th and the 9th, depending on how comfortable you are with the Arabic sources.
So that's the trendy bit of ancient history right now.
Yeah, that's the trendy bit of ancient history. It has been for a few decades, really, but people are still getting a lot out of it. So it's still, it's where you kind of go to papers and just hear something you'd never thought of before, or a source you'd never come across before. So that's definitely an exciting period. But even that, I mean, it's defined as late antique from the point of view of people who are thinking in terms of Greco-Roman history, because it's when the sort of start of it for most people is when Rome is going through what's sometimes called the 3rd century crisis, and basically Rome isn't working anymore as a kind of imperial structure or even state structure, and so it's something that happens after the real history, if you like, which is a bit problematic, but still, however it is, it's great that people are looking at it.
So going to that core argument about civilisational thinking, what is the genesis of Europe, this idea of a distinctive civilization? You're saying it's 18th, 19th century, but where do those people place the genesis of Europe?
So that's an interesting question, because it's not... So one thing to say is that it's not always Europe that's seen as the civilization concerned. So the relationship between the idea of Europe and the idea of the West is a very slippery one. And I think, there's a lot of different kind of factors in that, but one of them is that it's often uncomfortable for people working in North America at the time to think of themselves as European. I mean, this is a period when Europeans are or have very recently been the enemy, and that they, have liberated themselves from. So this is a new world, not an old world. So the idea of Europe, in a way that I think would seem very strange now to sort of in American nationalism, US nationalism, but in the, it was uncomfortable sometimes, the association with Europe.
So you're talking late 18th century.
Yeah, or even going into the 19th century. So you get the first, it's really a 19th century idea, I suppose, in that the first instances of the West being used are 1850s, basically, around 1850. Yeah, which is exactly the same kind of time as the idea of plural civilizations is really catching on and so on. So Europe is always one big part of that. And certainly when civilizations are first being talked about in the 1820s in the plural, Europe is the kind of go-to idea for the the one they're most interested in. But quite quickly, this idea of the West sort of comes up alongside it. And there's it's obviously a sort of Venn diagram, but it's never a total overlap. So that's one thing. But then it's an interesting question. But when they are talking about Europe, especially at the beginning, you get people like Guizot in the 1820s gives a series of lectures in the university or in Paris. He's at the University of Paris, and he's fundamentally interested in Europe, but he's also kind of a transitional figure when he's thinking about Europe as civilization, civilized, but also coming out of different past civilizations in the plural. And that's the sort of, I don't really talk about this in the book, but that's how the move is made from civilization in the singular, civilizations in the plural. The plural civilizations, the first ones in the past. So it's sort of the Egyptians, the Carthaginians,
and this is from Guizot.
The Romans. Yeah. And he's trying to kind of work through how modern European civilization, within which he sees French civilization as being the most kind of advanced version. That's always the case in these debates. But he's trying to work out how it relates to these multiple past civilizations. And one of the things he comes up with is the idea that it embodies diversity. that each of these past civilizations has a kind of single fundamental trait or character that defines it. But that one of the things about the sort of modern European character or culture is that it's actually what we'd now say diverse. That's not the term he uses. He probably says mixed. But that's a strength. So this is kind of an interesting idea, that the sort of early playing with the idea of multiple civilizations. It's that they're actually a sort of slightly primitive idea, something to be left behind, but that's quickly goes out of the discourse, and it becomes much more an idea of just separate places. Certainly by the middle of the 19th century, it's much more like the modern idea.
So Guizot's basically saying that Europe is inherently a hybrid civilization.
Yeah. And I have to say, it's not the only thing he said. This is one of these amazing kind of French lecture series where people just get up and talk and somebody writes it all down. So to actually extract, I have these conversations with my students when they have to read Foucault's lectures. So you have to understand the context in which these happen. These aren't, perfectly worked out, necessarily written texts that have a completely logical structure. But these are somebody sort of talking and often working things out as they're talking. So I would hesitate to say that Guizot would necessarily agree with my reading of what he talked about. But yes, I think it's a very I think it's a pretty reasonable interpretation of what he says, that Europe is an inherently kind of hybrid civilization. That is actually an idea that goes back to antiquity in some ways, that ancient Greek authors will talk about the differences between Europe and Asia, and they very much see themselves as in between the two. But it's not quite so. They're not sort of championing Europe here. They basically think Greece is very nicely situated in between Europe and Asia. Asia is too dry, too hot. It kind of depends on the particular author what they pick out, but usually for some kind of environmental reason, the people there are, often very intelligent and interesting, but a little bit lazy or indolent in some way. Whereas the Europeans, because they're very cold, are extremely strong and robust, but a bit dull. But there's a kind of trick to it, that they're also interested often in the mountains in Europe and how it creates a lot of different kinds of environment. And so the Europeans have to be, on this ancient reading, have to be quite resilient and sort of able to cope with different things. And that's one of the reasons that they turn out the way they do. Let's say it's not exactly seen as a positive, but it is seen as something a bit different. And it's somewhat like there's a wonderful book about the Mediterranean Sea called The Corrupting Sea. It came out in 2000, Peregrine Horden and Nicholas Purcell. And it sort of really restarted the whole Mediterranean, sort of ancient medieval Mediterranean studies. But their argument is a very similar one about the Mediterranean, that the sort of unity of Mediterranean history, which they're arguing for, but also the kind of strength of Mediterranean society over millennia, is in the extremely varied environmental pockets that you get around the Mediterranean Sea, and that in itself, that diversity creates a kind of necessity of connectivity, because you can't grow everything you need in one place, because the places are so kind of environmentally diverse that each individual place is suited to a particular kind of agriculture, whatever it might be. And so you sort of have to be in touch with people, not necessarily very far away, but you have to be in touch with people who you're not actually living among. And that lends a kind of intensity and robustness to relations. So I think you can see these different instances of this idea that hybridity is strength, essentially.
So when you've got Greek writers talking about being this, bridge between East and West, between Asia and Europe, clearly they see Asia as bits of Anatolia. Obviously there's Greeks as well.
Turkey.
Modern Turkey, yeah. Persians, and then there are some, assertions about people further east and I think by the time of the Romans, it's quite clear there's this thing called China and Chinese culture. Even the Greeks, they're kind of hinting at it or not, they're not quite sure.
Yeah, even the Romans, they kind of call these people silk people, but they're not really sure. There are wonderful maps. There's a wonderful ancient Roman map that survives in a medieval manuscript that seems fairly certain to go back to, in its core, somewhere between the 1st and 3rd century CE. And it kind of ends at the Bay of Bengal. And there's a little sign saying, silk people, kind of above it. It's like somewhere up there, But they definitely know a lot about India. But even the Greeks have a reasonably good idea, probably not like port by port, if we're talking about classical Greece or 5th, 4th century BCE. They're not going to know yet huge detail about somewhere like India, or alternatively the steppe. But they do have the general shape of it. They know the capital cities. They know, and they know sort of encounters, usually military encounters that have taken place. So there's a fair amount of, not necessarily pin sharp, but kind of curious knowledge.
So that's Asia. And obviously, Alexander goes, he literally goes into India. But what do they think of as Europe? Do they think of Cornwall as Europe? Do they think of, Algeria as Europe or the West, rather, I should say?
So one of the things I'm arguing in the book is that they don't have a concept of the West at this point. That the first...
But they know the East, right? They know these dudes over here.
They talk about Asia. And they sometimes use East as a kind of cardinal direction. You'll talk about the path of the sun going from East to West and so on. So it's not that they don't have that concept of East and West as different directions, opposites or, a bridge or whatever. But they don't have the same idea of, or at least I would argue that there are no clear instances of an idea of ours like the East, the Orient, or the West. And that really comes along with Christian writers like Augustine, who are basically just trying to do some interesting geography. Because the ways that you can divide the world up before that, continents are quite an old idea, not accepted by everyone. So the Greek historian Herodotus talks about how you have these continents of Asia and Europe and Africa, and it's all a bit silly, and nobody even knows where the borders are, especially of Europe, and they're just named after women, and what's all this about? It's clearly all the same landmass. So they even know that. They know that continents are basically a kind of human construct. They're not, or at least the continents of Afro-Eurasia are a human construct, certainly until the Suez Canal came along. So you could be that is a thing they use. They use continents, but continents don't really give you East and West. They give you sort of three different things. And the idea of Europe and Asia is much stronger than the idea of Africa. Like quite often, Africa is either subsumed, sometimes into Europe, more often into Asia. So it's more of an idea of north and south. And that makes sense. And you can also see it in kind of climate diagrams, ancient climate diagrams, where what they're interested in is how the kind of zones from north to south, like where you can grow what, essentially. That's much more important as knowledge in an agricultural society than the difference between East and West. The difference between, San Francisco and Lisbon doesn't really matter very much if you're growing oranges. Right, but the difference between Lisbon and London really does. So it's much more important, the north-south thing than.
So that's kind of a luxury. That's a luxury belief of post-agrarian societies to speculate on how this place is different to here, whereas actually, like you say, where everybody's peasant farmers, it's kind of stupid thing to even think about. Exactly.
So I'd say again, it's like not everyone agrees with me on this, but I think it's a pretty kind of solidly defensible claim that the modern ideas of East and West really are at the very best late antique, and the idea that they are they have a sort of moral or even a social aspect to them is much later even than that. So I think a lot of the ways I think that people just learn to talk and write about the ancient world are a kind of inescapably modern. In a way, it was invisibly but inescapably modern, and I think the East and the West are one version of that.
So where do the Greeks think they're from? So what's their genesis as a people?
So they have there's a whole lot of different theories. So one thing is they don't really think of themselves as a people. So the idea of being Greek is actually rarely found among people writing in Greek in antiquity. Not never, but it's pretty rare. And it comes up in particular circumstances. So you get a kind of outburst of Hellenism, like the idea of being Greek, right after around and after the Persian Wars. Only for a generation or two. But basically, this is a conflict which draws a lot of different Greek cities to actually fight together for the first time. Not all of them by any means. Plenty of them allied with the Persians instead. But, a bunch of them did ally with Athens and Sparta. And that idea of we're all Greeks together was very helpful for that. So that's one kind of example. You do get examples earlier than that when Greek speakers start settling or invading around the Mediterranean, however you want to see that period, kind of a couple of centuries earlier. And they're coming into contact with each other in sort of foreign places, like overseas for the first time. So not just as neighbouring cities, but as neighbours in a very foreign land. Then you get kind of moments where people are kind of interested in the idea of we're all Greek together, we have the same gods, that kind of thing. Yeah, but it's not as common as you'd think, given how easily we just talk about, and I talk about the Greeks and so on. I mean, it's much clearer. The Romans, it's a question of do you have Roman citizenship or not? That's very easy. If you're Roman, plenty of people do know, not only think they're Roman, but know they're Roman because it's a political identity. It's like being British or something. It's quite clear you either are or you aren't. But being Greek is much more complicated than that. And people have a very uncomfortable relationship with it, even then. So even, a century after the Persian Wars, a little over, you start to get people, even in Athens, saying things like being Greek is a matter of education, like really making it a very kind of cultural identity, not an ethnic identity. Whereas a couple of centuries before, you've got people inventing sort of genealogies of where you've got sort of regional heroes and suddenly they've all got a father, Helen, the Greek. And so there's different ways of creating that kind of community as well. Is it a fundamentally kind of an idea of a sort of blood relationship of some kind? Is it an idea of kind of clanship? Is it an idea of culture? And people try all these things out, and none of them really stick. So yeah, that's the problem. Sorry, I've forgotten the original question now. I've got
where do the Greeks come from?
Where do they come from?
Well, you were saying about what is a Greek? I mean, this is really interesting in Robin Lane Fox's biography of Alexander the Great, which is fascinating. Now he just writes his little columns about gardening and the FT, which is great. Very real range, very very bright. He's obviously written this book about the Iliad as well. I don't mean to. Great writer, but this book's about 20 years old. And he talks, I think, very convincingly about these various Greek colonies set up by Alexander in all parts of the world, all the way through to Afghanistan. Yeah. And basically, if you speak Greek, if you have a gymnasium, if you worship the right gods, you are Greek. Yeah. And that applied in Anatolia and bits of Persia, etc. And that's really impressive and incredible, and that's something to think about right now in the 21st century. But that feels quite different, like you say, to the origin myths of Homer's Greeks.
And also, we don't actually know what these people thought they were. No doubt some of them would have thought they were Greek. More likely, they would think they were from the particular hometown or something. And of course, an awful lot of them were Macedonian, which was a separate identity. And so Alexander himself is king of Macedon, and the Greeks are some of the first people that he conquers. And the Greek cities of mainland Greece, and then he goes to liberate, very, very generously liberate the Greek cities of Anatolia, modern Turkey. But although he kind of aligns himself with this sort of Hellenic mission and the freedom of the Greeks, which is a great ancient slogan, going back to the Persian Wars, but he. He's identified plenty of the time as Macedonian. His successor kings are called Macedonian, both by themselves and in the languages of places they conquer, like Babylon and so on. So you've got that complication. Those people in those colonies he sets up, they're not a lot of them are soldiers who originally came from Macedon, rather than from what we would sort of now call Greece, or indeed what even the ancients would have called Greece.
But they orthogonally, I mean, they didn't think they were Greek. But you correct me, because this is a big debate. Was Macedon Greek? Was Alexander Greek? But they were kind of Greek. There was a broad consensus. They were sort of Greek. They weren't fully Greek, but they were sort of Greek. Or no?
We just don't have very much evidence for it. I would hesitate to say that isn't the case, because I think we just don't know. So, I mean, the question of Alexander himself, there are clearly circumstances in which he identifies and is identified as Macedonian, and there are circumstances in which he aligns himself very closely with a kind of Greek cause or Greek culture and so on. A lot of these places will be Greek-speaking. Greek is sort of one of the linguae francae, I suppose, of the ancient world. I'm not sure what the plural of that is really supposed to be. But certainly used in that part of the world. But there are debates over whether Macedonians can compete in the Olympic Games, for instance.
Exactly.
So one of Alexander's ancestors, there's a kind of debate about, is he allowed to compete? If he isn't allowed to compete on the grounds that he's not Greek.
But they did, right?
But is that because he's really Greek, or is that because you don't actually have to be Greek to compete?
Right.
And there's no rule saying that. So you often read in textbooks, you had to be Greek to compete in the Olympic Games. But the only thing we know about that is that somebody raised the question over whether this earlier Alexander was allowed to compete. And then kind of in the end he was. And there's again quite a lot of assumptions that really was, because, people decided he was somehow really Greek, or he kind of managed to convince them. And he did come up with another of these sort of wonderful kind of fictional genealogies where certain Macedonian figures are kind of mapped onto Greek figures and so on. So there is, it's not that that's not an issue at all, but it's actually kind of weirdly unclear what the final outcome is. Or is it just that everyone decides that this isn't worth fighting over? Yeah, because he's quite a powerful king.
Yeah, maybe he'll kill you.
Yeah. I mean, he's not as powerful as his as Alexander III, the Alexander the Great. But still, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't have wanted to rile him particularly. So we don't really know. But the main thing is that the people who are living in these colonies, so, I mean, if colonies is the right word. So, yeah, these cities that are founded by Alexander, sometimes by some of the kings that come after him, but a lot of them founded by Alexander himself, including places as far away as, modern Tajikistan. There's one.
Crazy.
I know.
And they were there for ages, right?
Yeah, and they're all called Alexander Town. It's brilliant. And one of them, so the one in Tajikistan, Alexandria Eskate, Alexandria the furthest away, that it actually was took over from a Persian town that was called Syropolis, or Cyrus Town, the Persian king. So they were all playing these kind of crazy games out in Central Asia, way beyond the core of even the Persian Empire. But what we don't have from these places is very much actual kind of inscriptional evidence. We know that there are Greek speakers in these places, clearly. There are Greek inscriptions, but they're not really dealing with matters of identity. There's a famous inscription from Central Asia, from modern Afghanistan, that kind of reproduces some of the maxims from Delphi and so on. But, is that because people believe that they're fundamentally Greek, and this is the omphalos, or the navel of the Delphi, is the sanctuary at Delphi, is the navel of the world, because it's in Greece? Or is it because, people are interested in this kind of interesting thing that is being brought from far away, and we just don't know why do people do that? And so the gymnasium and so on. There's a town, Ai-Khanum. This is the town I'm talking about in Afghanistan. We don't know its ancient name. There are some guesses, but it's either one of these colonies or something like that. It's a settlement of that era, and it's this extraordinary mix. They've got a theatre that you wouldn't be surprised to find in the Peloponnese. They've got a gymnasium that's the biggest in the entire Greek-speaking world.
Wow.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely incredible. But they've also got all these temples that look totally to Central Asian. And there's Greek inscriptions from there, but there's plenty of evidence of other kinds of people living there too, or maybe everyone was another kind of person, and just having a Greek theatre was, something some local rich person thought would be nice. I mean, these kinds of things are very complicated. And if you go in kind of wanting to find Greekness and Greeks and so on, you absolutely can. But if you go in, the sort of fundamentally boring and skeptical point of view, it's very easy to get to a position where you just don't know what's going on in these places.
I mean, what I find really remarkable about these Greek-speaking sort of cities, civilization, all the way through to Central Asia, is just how long some of them lasted. You know, I think you tell me the numbers, but I think for some of these places, you know, they're lasting like up to 800 years after Alexander or whatever it is. And you think, well, 800 years ago was like the 1300s for us. You know, it's just mind-boggling, especially given the technology at their disposal, the idea that that kind of civilization could endure for that length of time. Did the Greeks think that their origins were from further east? Because obviously Europa was originally a Phoenician goddess, but again, child of a goddess. Or?
Yeah, well, no, she's a princess.
Sorry.
She's a princess of the city of Tyre, but her father is Egyptian, so it's even more complicated. She ends up, so she gets taken. This is the famous story where she meets Zeus on the beach at Tyre, which is really one of the most beautiful beaches in the world. And he's disguised as a bull, and somehow that means she falls in love with him. It'll be a very beautiful bull. And he takes her off on his back and over to Crete. And there, of course, he doesn't hang around very long. And she marries a local king. And then, you know, her sons with this local king fight, and she ends up retiring to Turkey with one of them. And they become this... legendarily, they kind of set up this new sort of community there. So she's an extraordinary figure who just kind of wanders around the Eastern Mediterranean, kind of complicating everything. The one place she never goes is Europe. Which I just love. Again, the Greeks don't think they're European. So they don't really associate themselves with her. So the actual stories that are told in Greece are a whole lot of different things. And usually it's not about the Greeks, it's about individual cities. But people from individual cities will say they come from a particular place, and unless they're Athenian, where the Athenians claim to be autochthonous, born from the land itself, from the very earth of Athens. That's very unusual in the ancient world in general. Rome is probably the only other kind of famous city that actually... There's an idea, it's actually in this case, certainly historically perfectly plausible and valid idea, that the fundamental population of Rome is from the local villages and so on. But usually people do kind of make stories about how they've come from somewhere else. And what often happens in Greece, in the archaic period, when people are kind of constructing these tales about where are they from and so on, is that there are stories about different regional groupings, and they map onto different ways of speaking, so different dialects of Greek. There's Dorians and Ionians, and then some sort of smaller groupings. They're the two big ones, the Dorians and Ionians. And the Spartans are supposed to be Dorians, a subset of the Dorians. The Ionians, sometimes associated with Athens, particularly associated with the coast of Turkey. The kind of settlements there are supposed to be migrant Ionians, among others. And so, but even then, it's not about coming from a particular place, because the idea is that these are groups of people who are moving around, who are constantly on the move and migrating in a sort of rather misty past. It's kind of Dark Ages sort of era of what Homer's writing about, but all a bit murky. A lot of them are originally the sons of Hercules. The sons of Hercules get all around the Mediterranean. He must have had a lot of sons. But a lot of these stories, somehow you go back and back and back, and you end up not at some original Greek, but at Hercules as the sort of father of everybody. And then there is this figure called Helen, Helen with a double L, who sort of turns up in the archaic period when he's invented after his sons are invented. So he's got these sons of Ion, Dorus, and so on, who are sort of fictional founding figures of these big regional groupings, big dialect groupings.
Kind of similar to Noah.
Kind of, yeah, exactly.
Ham, Shem, and...
Yes, exactly. Except if you got Ham and Shem first, and then Noah was only invented afterwards,
right? To
kind of bring those groups together into an overall idea of Greekness, and that kind of thing. These sorts of stories are written down with enormous enthusiasm by the various antiquarians and so on. They're great. I mean, how much any kind of average person wandering around what we now call Greece actually knew of these stories or cared of them beyond perhaps the ones that are particularly associated with sort of her city or group or whatever. We just don't know again. But no, I mean, it is this idea of not necessarily coming from anywhere, but coming out of movement. It's very distinctive, I would say, of that period of Greek thinking. And then later, there's a lot of idea of being a colony. So the idea of some of which is true, certainly. It's often hard to tell exactly which ones are true. But the idea, particularly Western settlements, will kind of attach themselves to a particular, often quite a famous city in the East, and say, yes, we're from that city. Whether or not true.
So we're talking, a couple of hundred years BC, etc., for a lot of this conversation, but clearly,
or even 600 or 700.
Yeah. But we can go way further back.
Yeah.
And that's, a big chunk of the book at the beginning, which for me is actually just the most illuminating stuff. And I really, really want to talk about this in particular and the Bronze Age collapse. But first, what was the Club of Great Kings?
Oh, this is great. So we know about the Club of Great Kings because of this extraordinary archive of letters that are written essentially to the king of Europe, to the king of Egypt. So the pharaoh, and by then he is beginning to be called pharaoh. And they're written by other kind of big kings of the period. So the king of the Hittites, who control what's now Turkey, basically. The king of the Mitanni, who are the people who sort of kind of precursors of the Assyrians, sort of neighbours and precursors. The Babylonians, and so on. So these sort of group of, and it sort of varies between, let's say, 4 and 8 big imperial powers in Western Asia and Egypt, essentially. And they are all dependent on each other. Like they're dependent on and often it comes from metals, that they're dependent on each other's providing certain kinds of metals or just providing money. In a lot of cases, the king of Egypt is particularly rich. Egypt is an extraordinarily metal-rich area. And so that people often want the king of Egypt to send them what they call presents. But they're also exchanging women all the time. There's sort of, I mean, this is a really very far-flung network where journeys between them are often overland, which is going to be extremely difficult and dangerous, very long, difficult and dangerous. And yet you get the impression from this huge kind of pile of letters. There are kind of, more than 100 letters, and covering quite a short period, and not necessarily all the letters from that period, but a period of, say, 15 years or something, a couple of different Egyptian kings. Where there's this idea of constant communication and people are having parties and inviting each other or not inviting each other. People are getting offended. They're constantly acquiring more wives from each other and they call each other brothers. And then there's this whole other brother kings. And there's this whole other group of people, smaller kings of smaller places and cities and so on, who call them great kings. And so it's this sort of kind of group of kings who no doubt within their own realms, I see themselves as absolutely, the most powerful, top of the hierarchy and so on. But they actually kind of acknowledge to each other that they can't operate without each other. And when they, in fact, do that, some of those cards begin to collapse. And this is the great story told in Eric Klein's book, 1177, that the dependency between them is so great that's really kind of one of the best explanations for the end of the Bronze Age, is that, once things go wrong for some of them, that makes things much worse for the others.
Again, that's such resonance for today. Firstly, that the idea of, global interdependence and peace, but also the argument that's made by some where we've built such levels of complexity into the global economy that collapse when it starts can look quite innocuous and get Quite bad, quite quickly.
Yes. That collapses, a collapse in, or mortgage problems in one continent can create a worldwide financial collapse. Absolutely.
So you've got this very handsome map at the start of Band of Brothers, which is about precisely this. And it's showing these various great kings, Mitanni. And then this is really, really interesting for me. So Cyprus is called Alasia. Because it sounds so oriental to my brain, Alasia. And then Greece is called Ahiawa.
Yes, it seems so, or either Greece or maybe one Greek kingdom, because again, it probably isn't. Different views on this. The evidence is extremely meagre because Greece really wasn't a very important part of this world. It's because they didn't really have many mineral resources and so on. Not nothing, but not compared to the agricultural or mineral resources of these bigger kingdoms. So, but there is this place that gets mentioned in correspondence between these kings called Ahiawa, and that seems most likely to be some kind of Greek kingdom, and within that, most likely to be the kingdom based at Mycenae. That seems to be the biggest power in Greece. Now, how much of mainland Greece it actually controls is very controversial matter.
So for people with the very sort of basic levels of historical knowledge with regards to this, you've obviously got the Minoan civilization in Crete. You've got the Mycenaean civilization in mainland Greece. And you're saying that this is the Ahiawa that...
Yes, I think that's the best. I mean, another bit of evidence may come to light tomorrow. Some tablet may come to light that shows that actually it's somewhere in Western Asia and Anatolia, modern Turkey, or that perhaps it's an island or something. So I wouldn't, but the most likely, from what we can see from the archaeology, the only power kind of west of Anatolia that would have the kind of economic heft to be involved in this world at all would be the kingdom based at Mycenae, probably. Now, that does bring up the kind of question of civilizations of Minoans and Mycenaeans. Like, this is one of my favorite kind of things that I realized writing this book that I hadn't understood before, that now we talk about civilization, Minoan civilization, Mycenaean civilization seem very different. Minoans on Crete, the Mycenaeans on mainland Greece. All sorts of ideas over the last several decades, 60, 70 years, about how the Mycenaeans, the more warlike ones, the Minoans, there's lots of women in their frescoes and so on. They seems like a kind of more attractive civilization. But what I realised is that actually the whole idea of them being civilizations is getting extreme. It's a 20th century idea. And the archaeologists who originally sort of found these societies, these kind of palace societies in Greece and on Crete, are basically rivals. And the ones who are digging up the palaces on Crete, which are the earliest ones, see the palaces on the Greek mainland as this sort of decadent, late, degenerate version of what they're digging up. So they call it late Minoan, what's going on. It's a chronological idea, late Minoan. Whereas the Greek archaeologists, the ones who are digging in Greece, some of whom are actually Greek, and not all of them by any means, they see what's happening on Crete as this sort of primitive precursor. So they'll talk about that as early Mycenaean and so on. And the idea that these are actually two completely separate civilizations is it comes out around about the time of the Second World War, really. And it's basically about scholarly disputes, and people, around then, people get to have their own civilizations to work on, and they don't really kind of fight anymore.
Basically, when it comes to history, don't listen to any historical analogy, because it's often some intellectual beef between people. So you've got the Babylonians, the Mitanni, the Hurrians, Hittites. This is an enormous area. And how many kingdoms, in terms of the Club of Great Kings, it's like 6 or 7 maybe?
Yeah, it varies. So there are sort of 4 kind of core ones, and then there are people like the Mitanni get beaten out by the Assyrians at a certain point. So we're talking sort of 4 to 6, let's say, big powers.
And they have a shared court language of Akkadian.
Yes. They're using, even in Egypt, they're using as their shared diplomatic language Akkadian, in the same way that, doctors or lawyers would have used Latin in Europe long after people were actually speaking Latin on a sort of daily basis, certainly most places, or even French, even later than that. Or now English, I suppose, although English is so kind of widespread that it's a slightly different kind of phenomenon. But the idea of a kind of imperial or diplomatic language is really an important part of my story as well, because those sorts of shared languages that nobody really considers their own really militate against civilisational thinking in a lot of ways. And when people find alternatives to them, vernaculars, people start writing in the alphabet, for instance, write Levantine languages, so Phoenician, Hebrew, and so on, in the alphabet, they're on a much smaller scale, and they're kind of consciously different from these big core languages and so on.
I mean, the idea of a global language is probably a strange one to use, but that's kind of what it feels like. In 1350 BC,
Yeah.
it's just so alien, I think, to most people's instincts about that period of time.
Though it's interesting to call it a global language is really interesting, because in a way I feel that's obviously right. That's a great analogy. But on the other hand, it's like modern global languages, like English or even like Spanish or Arabic, whatever it may be, that there are large parts of the world that actually don't speak these languages. So the whole of Europe, is cut out by these languages. There are letters by the king of Akiyawa, this slightly mysterious kingdom that's probably on mainland Greece. I don't think there are any letters in Akkadian, but there are a couple in Hittite, which is, the sort of second level international language. So presume there are translators and so on. But in general, anybody who's living in what's now Europe is basically cut out of this big international diplomatic world because these were not standard languages. You get, archaeologically, you find tiny little inscripted trinkets more than anything, with a few maybe Egyptian characters on some hieroglyphs or a little bit of Akkadian. Some of them are even kind of weight standards. It seems like they belong to merchants. But a lot of the time, it just look like, the way that a teenager might buy a T-shirt with some completely foreign script on, having no idea what it says, and it might even be nonsense. But this is a world that's cut off from the kind of international diplomatic mainstream.
So that's 1350 BC. I just talked about the map in your book. And then something really bad happens around 1200 BC. So 150 years, 200 years later, maybe.
Yeah.
What was it?
Well, so I think what I would describe it as a really bad series of coincidences. Like a whole lot of bad things happen at once, and part of it is to do with the interdependence of these big kingdoms. That when one of them goes, that leaves the others much more vulnerable. But it doesn't just happen to the big kingdoms. It happens in Greece as well. It happens along the Levantine coast, these small city-states. Not all of them. Some of them don't do too badly, but a lot of them are just disappear at this point, and disappear kind of in fire. A lot of the time. So it's not that people are just sort of moving on or something. There's clear signs in a lot of places of destruction. Now, whether that's actual attacks or
over what distance are we talking about? So you're saying Levantine coast and then Greece?
Levantine coast, Greece. It goes... Signs of a real economic downturn would go as far as Babylonia here. Signs of attacks and battles, and also kind of like written evidence for attacks and battles on the Egyptian coast, and then the Egyptian kingdoms collapse and so on. Yeah, Cyprus. So it's a pretty big area. Individual cases vary. So some of them seem to be pirates of one kind or another. There are a lot of pirates. Pirates are attracted by economic success. Even merchants, perhaps is the best word, that it gives people opportunities to conduct trade in a more involuntary way, let's say. So I think you get sort of outbreaks of piracy, particularly in the Mediterranean, at times of great economic success. And there's a lot of shipping going backwards and forwards. So that's one thing, but one sort of, but then who are the pirates and so on is another question. But then there's also probably a certain amount of local disputes happening. There's also it's becoming clear there's an environmental aspect to it. There's the weather is unhelpful in a lot of these places. And the evidence for that is tricky because it is such a large area. And when you have evidence, it's often for a very small area, the sediments from one lake or something. And so you can't, how much you can extrapolate from that. But a bigger picture is building up where certainly the climate doesn't help big agricultural empires in this era. So basically a whole lot of things are going on at once. And what it leads to is the removal of that top level of power, that you no longer have these great kings or even the smaller kings of places like Mycenae and so on. There's also a larger picture of depopulation and it's interesting, of a sort of economic downturn in the sense that there's certainly less exchange going. That's a sort of, if you like, international, in inverted commas, exchange. A lot more places are involved in even overseas trade and so on after this. So it's a question of everything's coming down to a smaller scale. So it's a kind of, for some people are going to see this as obviously a good thing. Some people are going to do well out of it. I mean, how many people do well out of it is, a question of great debate. But things change and things come down to a smaller level. You get really interesting things like the loss of writing in places like Greece, where you have written writing in the late Bronze Age. This is, Linear A, Linear B, and so on. It's a form of the Greek language, the later Greek language. But then, as far as we know, it isn't written down again for about 400 years. And so
it's quite possible that what we would today call Greeks, they forgot how to write for 400 years. Or they forgot how to make the materials to write.
Or forgot how to make the materials, or didn't have the materials to make the materials. Or, and I think this is the kind of most interesting possibility, by no means the most necessarily plausible one, that it's actually a decision. That writing, so what we can see of Linear B in particular, which is Linear B is the one that they used to write Greek in the mainland. Linear A is used on Crete to write a different language, very similar writing system. But Linear B, I mean, what we have left of it at least, which may not be all of it by any means, it's very much kind of accountancy. It's how many sheep, how many, flagons of wine, whatever. And it may be that that's actually not helpful for a lot of people to have their, agricultural yield written down by people who can then tax it for a king or a priest or whoever it may be. So I think it's not clear there's anything like literature written, and there's plenty of storytelling, certainly, much of which you can then see in later Greek literature. But the sort of, shadows of it. But actual writing seems to have been used potentially quite an oppressive way. So I think the turn away from writing to a more oral culture, it's really often seen as, one of the very bad things about this period. But I suspect for a lot of people, forgetting how to write could actually be quite useful.
So the way you've put that, which I didn't really detect in the book, but the way you've put that is basically there are one of two things has happened. Either the civilization equivalent of a nuclear war for us today, to comprehend the sort of, you literally don't write anything for 4 centuries. Multiple cities are, covered in inches or centimeters of ash. Just mind-boggling civilizational, it's called the Bronze Age collapse, right? Mind-boggling civilizational collapse. Or the idea, and in a way it's actually more interesting, that this is a social choice. And with technologies, we very rarely use those words, social choices. The idea that actually collectively you would decide to use or not use certain technologies and techniques. Are you familiar with Neil Postman?
No.
So Neil Postman's, he's a theorist of technology, and he writes a great book called Technopoly.
Okay.
And he says effectively after the sort of mid-20th century or early 20th century, technology is no longer something that we think of as a tool using society, but it's something that uses us effectively. Mm-hmm. We look at people as units to be maximized to the needs of technology rather than the way around. It's less woo-woo than that. It's quite empirical language, but very interesting. And I love.
How does slavery come into his story? 'Cause it sounds.
So he basically in the book Technopoly, he says he's got this tripartite structure. He says tool-based society, which we've probably had for 12,000 years.
Yep.
He then talks about technocracies,
Okay.
where you have the development of division of labour, manufacture, so paper, gunpowder, etc. And then he talks about technopoly, which is quite distinctive in his mind to technocracy.
Okay.
And it's about subordinating people to the needs of technological development as this thing, which is, in the 16th century, the idea of technological development in its own regard was just a very alien thing.
Yeah.
So he talks about Francis Bacon and his idea of, what enlightenment would be. Well, it's about enlightening the faculties of the individual, whereas actually in the 21st century, progress for us is bending our faculties to the needs of technological optimization. Fascinating. But anyway, this seems super relevant almost for the 21st century, this idea that people would en masse turn away from a technology viewed as potentially oppressive. And in a way that's actually, I don't know, maybe it's not more interesting than like something analogous to a nuclear war, but it's pretty damn fascinating.
So this idea of mine that this is potentially a choice, I would say, is not extremely popular among my colleagues. But I think one thing is that it's actually it's perfectly compatible with the evidence, and so I think it's interesting that it's a possibility even. But also I think that thinking of tech, it's so easy to think of technology and as progress, and progress as either, inherently a good thing, or just inherently an inevitable thing. That history as progress is so kind of baked in to ideas about how history happened. I mean, it's getting harder and harder, obviously, to sustain that at the moment. But this AI sort of
not quite. Yeah.
It turns our brains to mush, but I think that to try and get away from the idea that technology equals progress equals human benefit is an extremely useful thought experiment at the very least.
Or the third option is, not that you've precluded that, but both things happen, which is there's some kind of collective collapse, and then in the aftermath of that, people make this sort of political choice. I mean, the equivalent would be some sort of massive global downturn, climate collapse, and people say, actually, AI was a bad idea, let's not bother.
Yeah.
Have you read, you've read so much, you probably don't get to read much fiction. Have you read Dune by Frank Herbert?
No, I haven't.
Oh, my goodness.
I was looking at it at a bookshop the other day thinking, should I?
Oh, you should.
Okay, great.
Because it's about a post-AI human civilization, 10, 12,000 years in the future. And the point is they develop people's cognitive faculties through drugs, and basically they're human computers.
Oh, wow.
So cool.
That sounds great.
Anyway, so we have the Bronze Age collapse. People forget to write, or Greeks forget to write. And then when do things pick up again?
So it happens to varying degrees in different places. Some places you almost see nothing at all. So I'm always very fond of the so-called Phoenician cities of the Levant, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, that kind of thing. And there, they really just kind of pootle on. And it's great because suddenly they don't have these kind of imperial overlords at their backs. And they start sending. So this is a kind of example of progress in technology. They start working out how to sail all the way across the Mediterranean. And so they can now get at the metals of places like Spain, maybe even Cornwall, and so on. So there are places like that where you actually just see them taking advantage of the fact that everybody else is having a really bad day for 400 years. But then there are places like Egypt where it's maybe a century or two, and then things kind of pick up again. Different things in different places. Some places never become big centralized monarchies again. So somewhere like Anatolia would be an example where sort of different kinds of things happen after that. Other places kind of pick back up again. You could see the story that leads to the Persian Empire and so on, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, the Persians, those big empires kind of carry on from the empires of the Bronze Age. And there is a gap. There is a gap. So Bronze Age Assyrians don't just carry on kind of seamlessly into the Iron Age, if you like. But they do. I mean, it is the same group of people based in the same place. So It varies. I would say the big difference, though, and the thing that really changes the way the world works is not the disaster of whatever kind it was, but it's the change from using bronze to iron. So during the period after this Bronze Age collapse, one of the things that happens is that iron making becomes possible. So iron, you have to heat incredibly high to make it work. It's very useful metal, but you have to get to very high temperatures. And so during the Bronze Age, the only people who really knew how to do that were the Hittites in Anatolia. And it was an incredible luxury good. Like if you wanted something iron, you had to write a really nice letter to the king of the Hittites, and he might or might not have any kind of kicking around in his palace. But it becomes developed maybe on Cyprus. It's not very clear, but it becomes a much more sort of normal everyday metal. And once you've got the technology, and once everyone is sharing this technology of how to heat it high enough to actually, mold it and use it and so on, then it's actually much better than bronze, which was the big international metal beforehand, because it's one thing, more or less. You can play around with it, but and it's quite widespread. You find iron in a lot of mountains around Europe, Mediterranean, so on, Western Asia. So it kind of leads to smaller worlds. Whereas the thing about bronze is that it's an alloy of copper and tin. You need about 90% copper, 10% tin. Now, copper's not that common. That you can usually get to it, say, within a few 100 miles, probably, from most places. Tin is incredibly rare, especially in the Bronze Age. So the only places that we definitely know they're mining tin in the Bronze Age are basically Afghanistan, on the one hand, sort of going into eastern Iran, and Cornwall, and sort of the far west. And there is nothing. There are some places in Germany where they maybe can find some tiny bits of it and later they mine it. But basically you have to go to one or the other, or you have to know people who are going to one or the other. And that explains an awful lot about what's so fascinating about the Bronze Age, these huge kind of clubs of kings and so on, and this extraordinary long distance. In graves at Mycenae in Greece, you'll have a grave that has carnelian from India and amber from the Baltic in the same grave. It's coming thousands of miles in both directions to this one place. But it's not coming for itself. It's coming because it's coming with tin or copper, whatever it might be. And that's a huge change, that just the Iron Age, this period after the Bronze Age, is sort of necessarily a more local era, because that fundamental necessity of getting hold of copper, and in particular tin, has just been removed.
So the Marxist in me, and good old Karl Marx, he says that as you develop the means of production, they become ever more socialised, ever more globalised. Capitalism necessarily creates a global market.
Right.
What you're saying is actually there was this technology transition where you had deglobalisation.
Yes,
because people needed each other less. So Karl was wrong.
Yes, yep. I'm sorry to break it to you like that, but I hadn't thought of it in that particular way before. But yes, it is quite, I think, an unusual example of where something that's undoubtedly a technological advance, in the sense that you can do something that does the same function cheaper and easier, is actually something that also deglobalizes the connections at the same time.
I've often thought about that with the the Star Trek? Is it the Replicator? The Replicator?
I don't know the Replicator.
Is it called the Replicator? Well, it just materialises whatever you want, like a cup of Earl Grey for Picard or a meal, or just makes you anything at a subatomic level. Like, if you have that, then there's no need for trade with anybody. But anyway,
that's great.
Yeah, but the idea that there's actually a historical example rather than a stupid abstract one from science fiction.
Probably, though, you wouldn't ask for iron, would you? If you could just have anything you wanted. Iron is not the first thing.
So a slight shift here.
Okay.
A political question. Should Latin and Greek be taught in all schools?
That's a great question. So I would say yes, actually, particularly Latin. I'm only saying not Greek because probably there are other things that should be taught in schools too, and I wouldn't want to completely fill up the timetable. But let's say Latin or Greek or both. And the reason for that is because they're really interesting, moderately hard languages that really make your brain think rationally. They're very organised languages, much more than English. So I'd say it's particularly true of English schools, should teach them. But they're easy enough that you don't need specialists to teach them particularly. And there's some wonderful programs now that essentially train teachers in other subjects who haven't learned Latin as children or students themselves to teach Latin. I mean, not to an extremely high level, but to enough to have this effect, where it's just a really useful language to learn to kind of help with all sorts of other subjects and so on. It's also interesting from a linguistic point of view. And it's a way into this incredible literature, which just reveals this alien world. And I think it doesn't take very much Latin or Greek before you get into a world where you kind of realise, wow, these people are completely different from us. They have completely different values. And I think that's a really helpful thing for kids to come across, that the things that, the idea that democracy is a good thing or that identities are fixed at birth, those kind of things, you can't think that after any kind of small encounter with Greek or Latin literature, I think. And so that's, the way that those languages and literatures make things alien is really helpful. Now, that would also be true of plenty of other languages as well, like Akkadian or Sanskrit, and of course many modern languages too. I'm thinking, have to advocate for ancient languages. But the thing about Latin in particular is that because it shares an alphabet with English, other modern European languages, it's a kind of easy way in. I mean, a lot of people are going to say, Latin's not that easy. And it's not that easy, but it's not that hard either. So yeah, I'm a big fan of Latin in schools. I don't think people should necessarily take it as a way of into doing Latin at university. I love the fact that in every British university now, you can do a classics degree without having done any Latin or Greek before. I think in some ways that's almost an advantage. You're coming to it fresh. But I do think that for the people who are going to go on to do science or maths or English or history, doing some Latin at school can only be a really good thing.
See, the argument that's made for learning Latin or Greek, ancient Greek in school, like for instance in Italian, Liceo Classico, they would make the argument that you don't like in the book, which is that this is the bedrock of European civilization and we should be in touch with our European, antecedents and so on. And that's not coded in Italy as a particularly right-wing idea, actually. Whereas
absolutely.
You hear it in the UK, even Farage, but steady on. So... but the thing is, strange enough, I'm kind of sympathetic to both ideas.
Okay.
So I classify myself as European. I mean, to be fair, one half my mother is European heritage, but I like that idea of a sense of long-term intellectual continuity for kids. But I also think it ties to that point you're saying about, it contextualizes the present so powerfully. And yeah, I think it's really empowering to look back at these societies and, like you say, see how different they are and just how flexible things can be, which kind of makes a mockery of this whole idea of European values, European civilization, ancient Greece. It's like they had pederasty, right? And I'm pretty sure we don't really venerate that stuff in our societies. And I think that's so useful. But then the counter argument would be, well, look, kids, there's not much time for them to learn. They should be learning about the new economy and digital technologies. Why on earth would they want to be reading, Hesiod in Greek? So what would you imagine? I'm making that argument. What would you then say to me? Because there are limits on how much time kids have in school every day. Why on earth would they learn Latin?
So I don't think you have to learn it for a lot of the time. I wouldn't say it has to be every morning, for instance. I wouldn't say it had to be just Latin, but I would love it if kids were learning languages more. That's a very boring thought, very widely shared. But I do think this is a kind of easy, organised way to do it, relatively easy, organised way to do it. So I think, even if it's only one lesson a week, that doesn't take too much time away from learning how to submit to AI, whatever else they're supposed to be doing.
That's basically the curriculum, right? Like, how do we,
Yeah, well, yeah, I'm sure. I don't want to criticise the teachers in any of this who are doing their absolute best in difficult circumstances. But I do think it is worth it. It is worth making time in the curriculum for for the arts, for humanities, and in particular for languages. I think this is actually going to be more valuable in the long run. I mean, when I was in school, we had a computer room and we learned how to write BASIC. And so, those old computer languages. This is, of course, completely useless. We spent hours doing this and learning how to do things that even, before I left primary school were outdated. I mean, there's teaching kids technology in the schoolroom. It's, they're going to be learning it out of the school much faster and much better, I think, than teachers are going to, they often understand it so much better than us to start off with. Whereas I think school can be for things that you don't encounter in daily life. I don't think teaching politics in school is as important as teaching ancient languages or...
Do you think ancient languages are more important than politics?
In teaching in school, yes, because politics is around us all the time. We shouldn't be doing it in school. People should be doing it at home, in the playground. They should be... I mean, when I was... 6 or 7 years old in primary school, I was selling the CND newsletter to my colleagues in school and that kind of thing. And we were having these conversations in the playground. This was just a totally state primary school in the Midlands. I don't think you need grown-ups to kind of patronisingly tell you, if you're a kid, about what you should think about civil society or politics and so on. But you do need someone to tell you how French works or how Latin works or... how to dissect a mouse or something. I say do that kind of thing in school.
I'm kind of in agreement. And I think once we have real-time translation, I'm sorry, this is probably the AI bit I like, but once we get real-time translation devices between people, I think that is going to be an extraordinary breakthrough technology with massive social implications, good and bad. In terms of connecting humanity, I think it would be really powerful. But then all of a sudden, it does change the incentives in terms of learning languages. Are you going to learn Spanish because, okay, well, it gives me a market of 600 million speakers or whatever it is? Or maybe you'll learn Welsh because your grandparent was from Cardiff, right?
Yes.
You don't need to think of it from a utilitarian perspective.
Want to read the epic poetry or something. So really, it takes it down to the real pleasure of language learning, that you're not doing it for just a functional use. I think that's actually very... I worry, I think a lot of people who teach about the kind of the way that... those translation, the fact that Google Translate in particular is getting so good that a lot of my graduate students will now use that instead of, really learning German and reading academic German and so on. I mean, it's not, it's fine until you get to the case where it has mistranslated something. But actually, that's a kind of a niche concern in all of this. I mean, the real kind of glory of it is that you no longer have to learn, how to order a cup of coffee, that you can actually, immerse yourself in temple inscriptions or something much more fun.
A Faust.
Yes.
I have another question. Now, we're it's not quick fire or anything as stupid as that, don't worry. But it's a sort of very modern question, which is, was Julius Caesar more evil, maybe not than Hitler, that's quite loaded, than Genghis Khan?
So I think my answer to that is... I don't care. I'm sorry. I don't care. He was a really bad guy. So was Genghis Khan. So was Hitler. But actually focusing on their individual biographies and strange psychologies, whatever leads people to commit genocide on enormous scales, which all those three people are doing. I mean, that's just pandering to them. Who cares? It's a terrible thing to have done.
But you say that, but I think that's true, obviously. But I think most people in Europe don't realise how many people Julius Caesar actually killed. That's the thing. People think Julius Caesar, they think some dude in a toga winning battles. But what he did in modern day France, for instance, he kills probably about 3 million people.
Yeah. We have ancient sources that say 1 million killed, 1 million enslaved. And perfectly respectable, not implausible. And very recently, there's been quite a lot of battlefield archaeology. This is a bit unfashionable, but it's actually fascinating at the moment what it's bringing up, where you can really see the kind of extraordinary devastation that his soldiers are committing, even within the battles themselves, no matter what happens afterwards. You get whole regions where nothing grows for centuries.
Wow.
Because he's basically wiped out the people who lived there completely.
And this is the Gallic Wars.
Yeah, in the Gallic Wars. I mean, it's unbelievably brutal, and none of it is a secret. He writes his own book about it. He writes 8 books of the Gallic Wars, describing as he goes on year by year what he's doing, why he's doing it. He talks about wanting to wipe whole groups out, and some of the kind of war crimes he's described in kind of loving detail. So none of this is. It's sort of, imagined or interpreted out of fragmentary sources. Yeah. It's all like written down.
It's not woke revisionism. No. Like he wrote this stuff down.
He gives it to us.
It's the Penguin edition. Yeah. Was he a product of his time, or was he just a psychopath?
So there were debates at the time in the Senate, as often you find out when people are said to be products of their time, that actually other people in their time are pretty horrified. This is like Cecil Rhodes, be another example. So there are debates at the time about whether what he's doing, particularly, it's interesting, it's actually not necessarily so much about the straightforward murder of hundreds of thousands to millions of people. It's when he's deceiving kind of Roman allies and so on, he gets into trouble. So it's when he kind of commits genocide through deception. It's particularly unpopular. But no, I mean, there are debates at the time, and some people think it's worth it and others don't. But he also has his own alliances and so on that are feeding into that. So are people supporting him or not supporting him because they're supporting him or not supporting him, or are they doing it because they actually believe this is right or wrong in some moral sense?
But I guess how exceptional was he as a Roman leader? So, for instance, the history of the USSR from 1917 through to 1990. Okay, not very long, but most people would generally agree that Stalin was kind of like the bigger psycho. And nobody thinks that Khrushchev was a bigger psycho than Stalin, right?
Yes, okay.
So how does in the pantheon of Roman leaders?
Yeah. No, it'd probably be the biggest psycho. Yeah. No, I'm happy with that. I mean, if we're going to rank the Roman leaders, I think no, he's doing this on a scale that has never been done before. And the other thing is that he's doing it as a private citizen, that he's a lot of his soldiers are people that he is basically paying out of booty. His position as the kind of Roman representative in Gaul is a rather sticky one. A lot of what he's doing is to avoid being prosecuted for completely different crimes in Rome itself, that he has to stay. And this is another thing that's familiar at the moment, that if he occupies certain kind of official positions within the state, he can't be prosecuted. So he has to move from magistracy to magistracy. And a lot of it is that. But it's a very strange time in ancient Rome, so the end of the Roman Republic, rather like the end of the Bronze Age, lots of different ideas of what's really going on, how unusual are the politics of the era, and so on. But there is no doubt that he has a great many people who are terrified of him, locally and back in Rome, and feel they have to act in certain ways in support of him. And that it will serve their own interests as well. So I think that it's again, I want to take this away from his own personality, even though he was without doubt a psycho, and you only have to read his stuff to see that. But the fact that it was possible for this to happen tells us more, I think, about what's going on in Roman politics at the time. This is a sort of breakdown of the institutions that essentially have built an enormous empire by this stage out of a single city, and this turns out to be not sustainable, and that's leads to a kind of monarchy again.
When I think about Caesar, you've got obviously Kaiser in German, Tsar in Russian, but even in Farsi, there's a name Kaysari, as in of the Caesar. Yeah. And you think this man has such an incredible legacy, and just really bad person. Yeah. You said he had a private army. What do you mean? Because they would have had the standards of Rome. So is it like the East India Company, or what is it?
No, it's not. It's a question of who is paying the soldiers, where are they getting. Essentially this is a war that pays for itself as it goes along, and increasingly in this period, and he's not totally unusual in this. It's been going on for some decades. These kind of big Roman generals will raise armies sometimes from their own regions. Pompey does that. Sometimes from their friends, sometimes kind of having legions kind of lent to them and so on. So it's a point at which soldiers will... Their experience of their situation is that they are working for a particular general and he's the one who's paying for them, and that their own successes under that general are the ones that are, paying for them to hopefully in the end retire back to their own homes and so on.
And this is also the case during the Republic.
Well, no, it starts.
This is all post-Republic.
No, this is the very end of the Republic.
Right.
So this is starting like 1st century BCE. So this is when it's really going on, where soldiers are going to, essentially the Roman army, which has been a kind of citizen militia, essentially, and it's becoming more of a collection of private armies in the sense that the soldiers, immediate well-being and safety, but also their long-term financial benefit from being involved in these wars depends on individual generals, and they will those are their generals. They won't just switch to another general next year necessarily. They're going to stay with this guy. So I think it's the fact that it's sort of difficult to kind of make a clear distinction between a sort of state army and private legions in this period sort of reflects the way the state isn't really working.
So there's a huge political crisis there. You've got a fragmenting elite. Again, it sounds incredibly relevant today for another arguably maybe late republic across the Atlantic.
Yeah.
And is there a world where Rome at that point fragments? Obviously, we then subsequently get the Roman Empire and it lasts for a long time. But is there an alternate reality where that whole thing just kind of collapses?
That's interesting. That's a really interesting question. Certainly, yes. The question is, what does it collapse into if that happens? Because the Roman provinces at this point have, in the kind of the core of the Roman Empire, you don't really have kind of local elites, if you like, surviving anymore. Of course, there are plenty of people who were there before the Romans turned up, and plenty of them doing well, but you don't have the kind of older monarchies and so on surviving. Now, there are places where that does happen, particularly in the Eastern Mediterranean, the client kingdoms, so-called, where it's quite, people do sort of break off and come back again on the edges quite a lot, places like Armenia and so on. So there is a bit of kind of friability, especially around the eastern edge of the empire. But in the West, it's an interesting question of especially what those core provinces could become. And I suppose whether the fact that the kind of infrastructure of empire has sort of structured the way places like Sicily and Sardinia and so on really work, even southern France really work now, kind of creates a logic of its own that actually helps to keep Rome together. So it becomes about who is going to lead this, about the fact that you need apparently the only way that it's going to work is you need some kind of more monarchic figure. Yeah. It's often the case with empires. Republics running empires doesn't work very well historically. It is an interesting question of why does the empire kind of create the conditions of its own survival? So
there's a kind of path dependence going on there, right? Mm-hmm. And I ask that because there's real relevance again today. If we're thinking about the United States as a late Republican empire, and there are some people in the US, right, who overtly say that's their project, right? You've got people like Curtis Yarvin talks about like America needs a monarchy. And I suppose that's why it's relevant because, there are probably there are three paths going forward for the United States. Either there's a kind of status quo ante, somehow you return to what it was before, this kind of weird political crisis it's obviously in, something constitutionally which centralizes power in a certain way, or disintegration of the US homeland gradually. You know, it doesn't have to happen quickly. They had a civil war in the 1860s. It can happen again, but nobody's saying that's going to happen next week. So I suppose there's like a pertinence there that, you know, if Rome is the example that, like you say, the empire creates its own logic where monarchy became the most likely outcome. And I suppose maybe for the US, that's also true. You know, so there's so many converging interests in how America works as an imperial power.
Perhaps you need the kind of formal imperialism for that sort of logic to kick in, though.
Right.
I think one of the strengths of American imperialism is its very informality. And I think that might leave more options open. And one option that you know, Trump doesn't have is to become the leader of a civilization state like Putin or Modi or something. He can't recast his bit of North America as a kind of something that's gone back for you know, millions of years or whatever in the same culture. So that's a kind of problem
That's true.
that I think would take a bigger man than Trump to solve. So it does kind of limit the options, I think, for sort of what happens next. And of course, you know, what Rome also shows us is that even very large empires break in the end. And, you know, somebody like Walter Scheidel has a wonderful book about how you know, in a way, the sort of strength of modern Europe is in the fact that after the breakdown of the Roman Empire from the 3rd century on, that it then never did go back into a single large power. There were always all these small competing powers, and that actually created, over the long run, a more sustainable prosperity and stability in a strange way. And perhaps we can skip the monarchy bit with America and go straight to, you know, a number of smaller republics and so on that would actually create a more stable situation long term. Because as you say, it's a young country, a really young country in its current form.
Yeah, I mean, you think about republics. You know, I think what the Venetian Republic is, you know, probably about 700-800 years.
Yep.
And the US is 250 years. You know, they got a long way to go.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting about the civilization state thing. Oh, you do get, again, people on the American far right who say, actually, the big mistake was 1776, actually.
Yeah.
And, you know, you need to have just Anglo, Protestant, white Americans, get rid of the liberal nonsense of the Constitution. But that, again, if you're going to do that, doesn't really feel like you can compete with China, India,
and also,
Russia.
You kind of have to get the Europeans to play along, and then maybe he can. But that seems like quite an ask. Again, particularly for the current American leadership. So I think that's another thing that's sort of it's not obvious that that's on the table for them, and I think they're not thinking hard enough about this. I think perhaps they should be thinking more about the Roman Empire. I mean, I think Elon Musk probably thinks quite a lot about the Roman Empire, but maybe he should think a bit harder.
So that's really interesting because I had a conversation a couple of months ago now with Peter Heather and John Rapley. They wrote this great book about how civilizations collapse. Again, that kind of feeds into the shibboleth of how Rome collapsed, and that they're actually not making that sort of Edward Gibbon argument. But anyway, and they say there's a great deal of pertinence to what's happening in 4th century Roman Empire and the West today. Really, have you read it?
I haven't read it.
Oh,
no.
it's
I'm looking forward to it. It's on my bedside table.
It's only about 140 pages. Yeah. And, you know, they say basically that the core necessarily develops the periphery through contact, through trade. And that's what leads to the demise of the Roman Empire. It's the fact that you're developing the periphery. And there's very big similarities with the West today and East Asia through global trade. Really fascinating. Anyway, so they say there's real resonances there. You're saying that somebody like Musk probably does pay attention to the Roman Empire. Do you think there are other people too, Jeff Bezos and whatnot? These megalomaniacs in Silicon Valley?
Yeah, I mean, the Musk thing is that, you know, we know that these clowns, his children, who is operating for him in the various American agencies.
And this is Doge.
Yes. So that you know, at least one of them kind of won a competition to decode papyri from Herculaneum, and you know, another of them is a kind of great enthusiast for the Roman Empire, and it's, you know, it's not really a career trajectory that I've thought about for my students, but it does seem like he's picking people with a particular interest in Roman imperialism. But I think the thing is, they're not thinking about it because they're not thinking about what went wrong. They see it only in terms of the kind of as an example or an ambition of the kind of thing they want, but they don't think about the fact that it was always very fragile, and it took a lot to keep that show on the road. And in the end, it broke down pretty badly for the Romans. So I think this kind of counterfactual thinking is actually useful in politics, and it would be nice to see a bit more of it rather than just celebrating the past as sort of glorious examples. Or what can we really learn from it? On the other hand, I don't believe any politician has ever learned anything from history, so I'm under no illusions that that's...
Really?
What? Give me an example.
Well, no, but we've got a bias basically to focus on. We don't know about their private conversations where they actually made a good decision by not doing something.
Yeah, that's true. That's true.
Because somebody's appealed to, well, actually, if you look at history, this happened. Okay, that's right. I mean,
that's true. And of course, they may be making bad decisions based on history too, that we just don't understand as being successful in their own terms.
True. Well, if you look at, I mean, the invasion of Iraq, people calling Saddam Hussein a second Hitler, blah, 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 blah. I mean, my goodness. Final question. What Hollywood movie is the most realistic about ancient Rome?
So...
Because I know it's not Gladiator 2.
No.
Denzel, I love him, but I don't think that's what it was like.
Gosh, I'm not sure that any of them are really very realistic, partly because they do tend to concentrate on the winners one way or another, even if it's the Gladiator winners. I have, in terms of getting the spirit of one aspect of the highest echelons of ancient Rome, I'm a big fan of the I, Claudius television series. I think realistic isn't quite the word, but it definitely captures something real. But I think what I'd like to say about Hollywood movies is that I think the movie Troy is brilliant. And it's a lot of people complain that it is not true to the original fictional story that Homer tells, but I think it's actually much better. The right baddies get their just desserts in Troy, and in general I think that's, of all the kind of ancient world movies, that one's the one that I think is just most satisfying to watch.
Is it accurate as well? The sort of the fickleness and capriciousness of Achilles. People were like, "Oh, Brad Pitt's really wooden," but in a way, I kind of feel like that's what Achilles is meant to be like.
Well, I suppose. I mean, he is a fictional character, so it's a bit difficult to say, I suppose. But yeah, again, I mean, I certainly that's one of the things that appeals to me about it. Is I think they're playing the characters in a way that feels more in the spirit of ways that people. Writing and listening and watching this stuff in ancient Greece would actually have felt connected to. That the heroes and the gods aren't heroic or godlike in our terms. They're often people who make really bad mistakes, and that's sort of what makes them interesting.
Oh, Josephine, Quinn, I wish we could speak for another 2 hours. There's been such a treat. We'll get you on again. Thank you so much for coming on Downstream.
Thank you very much for having me.